Hello everyone. Today I'll guide you through using our save system. We'll start by creating a simple float saveable to save and load the value of a slider. Then we'll move on to a more complex saveable that stores character data such as name, age, and position. Lastly, we'll demonstrate how to delete, add, and save this information. First, create a new script and add the following namespace using Lutor Games Save System. Then, create a float saveable variable named ratio saveable and a slider named ratio slider. In the start method, assign the ratio slider to the ratio saveable and set up an event listener for the slider's onValueChanged event. Every time the slider value changes, update the ratio saveable to reflect the new value. Now, move to the Unity editor and assign the ratio slider to the script. Important, do not set the same ID for different saveables unless you want them to share the same data. For now, set the default value of ratio saveable to 1, which will be used if no saved data is found. Finally, let's test it. As you can see, the slider now correctly saves and loads its value, and the save system is working as expected. Before we create a character saveable, let's first understand how the float saveable works. It is a child of base saveable float, where the type is float. Similarly, there's also a float list saveable, which is a child of base saveable but works with a list float instead. We'll use the same concept to create our character saveable. First, we need to create a serializable class called character that will store the following data. Next, create a class called character saveable that will be a child of base saveable list character. In this case, we're using a list character because we want to store multiple character data instead of just one. Now, let's rename the script from character saveable to character saveable and see how it works in the Unity editor. You'll notice that under the default value section, we now have a list of characters, as expected. To make our characters selectable, let's add a dropdown. We'll create an initialize character function to populate the dropdown with the character list. Here's how we can do it. 1. Clear existing options from the dropdown. 2. Loop through every character in character saveable.value. Note, character saveable.value contains a list of characters because we defined it as list character in the base saveable class. 4. Add each option data to the dropdown options. Make sure to call this method in the start method to initialize the dropdown when the game starts. In the Unity editor, you can now add a few default characters such as Lutor, Games, and LLC. When you play the scene, you should see that the dropdown works perfectly and the character names are listed for selection. Next, let's display the character information when a user selects a character from the dropdown. To do this, we'll create a display character information function that will update the input fields with the selected character's data. First, create public input field variables for each piece of character data you want to display, such as name, age, and position. We also need a way to track the current character selected in the dropdown, so we'll create an integer variable to store the current index and assign it to the dropdown's value. Inside the display character information function, retrieve the character data at the current index and assign its values to the corresponding input fields. This function will update the UI each time the user selects a different character from the dropdown. In the initialize character function, add a line of code to listen for the dropdown's onValueChanged event. Since this event passes an integer, we will use a lambda expression to call the display character information function with the updated index whenever the dropdown changes. Additionally, call the display character information function once during initialization to ensure the first character's information is displayed right from the start. Next, assign some random default values to your characters. When you test it, you should see that the character data updates correctly whenever you select a new character from the dropdown. Finally, let's add a function to delete the currently selected character. This is simple. Remove the character at the current index from the characters list, and then call the initialize character function to refresh the dropdown. We realize that we need to move the dropdown initialization code into a separate function. Let's create a function called initialize dropdown and move the dropdown setup code there. When initializing the dropdown, make sure to set the dropdown value to 0 to ensure it doesn't exceed the available options count. Once that's done, assign the necessary button to trigger the actions and run the test to confirm everything is working correctly. If there's no data available, the system throws an exception. To handle this, we'll create a method called isValidIndex that returns a Boolean. This method will check whether the current index is valid. If it's not, the input fields will be cleared and the function will return early. Also, ensure to include this validation check in the delete character method to prevent errors when attempting to delete non-existing characters. Now let's create the add new character function. This function will create a new character populated with the values from the input fields and add it to the characters.value list. After that, we'll call the initialize character function to update the drop-down list with the new character. Make sure to assign the method to the relevant button in the editor and test the process to ensure it works as expected. If you change values in the character data, they aren't saved by default. To resolve this, we'll create a save characters method. This method will save the current character data and update the saved values accordingly. We also need a helper function, getCharacterFromFields, which will return a new character object with the values from the input fields. In the save character method, we'll add the new character to characters.value and then call initialize character to refresh the drop-down list. To clear all the character data and reset the system, we'll add a clear all information function. This function will call clear on the saveable and reinitialize the character data. This example scene will be included in the package, so feel free to explore it and see how everything works in action. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we're always thrilled to see the projects you create with our tools. If there's a specific tool you'd like us to develop, just leave a comment and we'll do our best to make it happen. Happy creating, and see you in the next tutorial.